Hello. Welcome to Point of View. Today I want to talk about colonial mentality. A colonial mentality is the internalized attitude of ethnic or culture inferiority felt by people as a result of colonization, i.e., them being colonized by another group. It corresponds with the belief that the culture values of the colonizer are inherently superior to one's own. Let us watch Najee Madala's video on the colonial mentality of Filipinos.
The Philippines may be considered a country that is very deeply ingrained with their colonial mentality, especially in today's youth. It is reflected in our country's pop culture, media, and lifestyle, influenced by the ideologies of our colonizers. Instead of the country that is deeply rooted in their patriotic pride, their sense of identity, and their traditionalism, the nation's people seems to be ashamed of its flaws and inability to cope with other more developed countries. Filipino pride and resilience is what led the country to its independence. Yet some Filipinos prefer to shed these Filipino traits in favor of Western ideals. Essentially, Philippine culture is an amalgamation of different cultures, most notably Spanish, American, Japanese, and Chinese, although China was not a colonizer. The Chinese population in the Philippines was, and still is, very large. Among the colonizers of the Philippines, Spain's reign lasted the longest, and it is to no surprise that Spain's influence on the Philippine culture was among the strongest, if not the strongest. One of the telltale signs of the strength of Spanish influence over the Philippines is the fact that many words in the Spanish language are integrated into Filipino dialects. Some prime examples of which are Diyos, eskwela, guwapo, kalye, kabayo, kwento, karne, pamilya, sapatos, and bintana. Another strong influence Spain has over the Philippines is undoubtedly Catholicism. The Philippines is also the only predominantly Christian country in Asia. The power of the church is notable due to its influence in Philippine law. It is because of Christian beliefs that divorce and abortion is illegal. Catholic schools are also a product of Spain, and today it is these Catholic institutions such as DLSU, Ateneo, and UST that are among the most prestigious and best schools in the country. Without a doubt, many Filipinos possess last names of Spanish origin, such as Cruz, Garcia, Legazpi, and Flores. Many Filipinos also have Spanish first names such as Juan, Miguel, Carlos, Rafael, etc. Furthermore, the Philippines was also named after King Philip, the King of Spain at the time of the discovery of the Philippine Islands. Manila was also named and selected as the capital city of the Philippines by the Spanish. The most notable aspect of American culture in the Philippines is the concept of freedom. This includes religious freedom, democracy, and even free education. It is thanks to religious freedom that non-Catholic churches and beliefs came to be in the Philippines. Catholicism was once the national religion under Spain, and Filipinos were left with no choice at that time. Public schools were America's contribution to education in the Philippines. While Catholic schools were the best the country had to offer, they were also exclusive to the rich. Like the Spanish, many English words were integrated into the Filipino dialects, such as ballpen as ballpen, interview as interview, computer as computer. Being the colonizer that spent the least time ruling the Philippines, it is also no surprise that Japan's cultural influence over the Philippines is especially minimal compared to Spain, America, and even China. The primary forms of Japanese influence in the Philippines are technology and media, such as karaoke, videoke, cameras, and film. What does it mean to be a Filipino? There is a need for cultural change among Filipinos, and this process requires the Filipino consciousness to reject the admission of colonial mentality into the Filipino being. Filipinos must re-examine their mindset and rekindle their dignity for being Filipinos. Despite the permanent scars of colonialism in Philippine history, it provides a privilege to our culture. For a culture which is a mix of many other cultures is as interesting as a new species bred from horse and zebra. We have learned enough after centuries of colonization. It is time we stood on our own feet. Let us patronize and create our own culture. Poems, songs, and dances that retell the stories of the Philippines' oppression and its journey to freedom. Is that not something worth telling and listening to? Does that not make you more than proud to be a Filipino?
Next, We have a video about the colonial Hong Kong racist past provided with the courtesy of Asianometry.
Today, the Hong Kong British colony is looked upon with a little bit of nostalgia. The colonial government was seen as competent and well-run, especially in its later years. And those administrations did do some things quite well for all the people, not just the Europeans. But that view ignores some 130 years of Hong Konger history. Hong Kong was founded, and for over a century, run as a capitalist paradise on the backs of the extremely poor. An extreme European inner circle ruling a vastly larger Chinese majority. In this video, I want to talk about some of the racist laws and economic structures put into place by that European minority to guarantee their place at the top of the pile, and how long those structures actually lasted. Hong Kong back then was wild and dirty. The Times of London in 1858 explained that people in England saw Hong Kong as, and I'll quote, a place always connected with some fatal pestilence, some doubtful war, or some discreditable internal squabble. We cannot wish that the sea should take Hong Kong back to itself, because English life and English property would be endangered. But if these could be withdrawn, we should very willingly resign any benefits which we derived from its possession. 19th century writers, man, they had such a way with words back then. This perception is not unwarranted, for Hong Kong was a group of corrupt merchants and pirates ruled by administrators who saw making money as the number one priority. The island colony ran on the back of extremely cheap labor, smuggling, and of course opium. Hong Kong government revenue from opium in 1918 was over 8 million Hong Kong dollars, a staggering 46.5% of revenue. Sir John Bowring, Hong Kong governor in the 1850s, condensed the essence of Hong Kong's operating philosophy best. Free trade is Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is free trade. Hong Kong made money for its European rulers in unsavory ways. Those rulers sought to protect those privileges. When the British annexed Hong Kong, they told the island's residents that they would be governed by the quote-unquote laws, customs, and usages of China. Attempting to adhere to this promise would cruelly create a dual system, one for Chinese and one for Europeans. The colonial officials adopted a number of ordinances. Violating them if you were an Englishman would likely lead to just a fine. Violating them as a Chinese would result in a number of cruel and unusual punishments. Punishments that, per Ordinance Number 10 of 1844, were administered, quote-unquote, in conformity with the usages of China, as has hitherto been usually inflicted on natives. So, quote-unquote, local punishment for locals. This was unusual for a British colony and wasn't the case in places like Sri Lanka and Singapore. Here are a few of these Chinese punishments. Floggings. Floggings in Hong Kong were particularly brutal. Colonial surgeons found that they often created deformities and left permanent scars. An 1847 ordinance allowed punishments of up to 60 strikes with a cane or a rattan. Flogging would remain on the corporal punishment ordinance until 1990. Tail cutting. At this time, Chinese men had a tail on the back of their head to show their respect for the Qing emperor. Cutting it off would make a Chinese man a social pariah. There are no records of tail cutting as a traditional Chinese punishment actually practiced in China proper, but the Hong Kong colonial administration practiced it ever the same. Public hangings. Late 19th century Hong Kong was the only British colony to do public hangings. The authorities installed a gallows permanently for public viewing. The first public hanging in Hong Kong history happened in 1845. It was scheduled for 3 Chinese men charged with attempted highway robbery, but they committed suicide in prison first. It would take 50 years, 1895, and substantial pressure from the UK motherland for the colonial government to finally do its hangings in the quote-unquote privacy of the prison grounds. Many of these rules slowly became less relevant after World War II, but a lot of them are still in the books and can be pulled out as needed by the ruling minority elite. And let's talk a little bit and go back to privacy. Speaking of privacy, Chinese people had no privacy from British authority. An 1846 ordinance empowered the colonial authorities to enter any Chinese-owned house or boat. Every Chinese person had to register with the colonial government. If you failed to do so, then you were fined 50 Hong Kong dollars with the possibility of expulsion. A Chinese person expelled from Hong Kong back then had a big arrow branded on their left ear. This way, they can always be detected if they were to try to return. Chinese people could not vote in Hong Kong. They did not even know how they were to be governed because all Hong Kong governance happened in English. How many Chinese back then knew English? And Chinese could not be out on the streets of their own city late at night. In 1870, a law was passed such that no Chinese could be on the streets from 9 p.m. to sunrise without a pass. And even if they had a pass, they had to carry a lantern with them. This ordinance was not repealed until 1897, 27 years later. There is no rational reason for requiring a Chinese, and only Chinese, mind you, both peasant and businessmen alike, to have to carry a lantern, except for racism. Hong Kong's 19th century British saw the Chinese as a lower yellow race. To quote a Hong Kong memoir, "I have actually seen a European rickshaw passenger throw his fare money to the ground rather than risk touching the rickshaw coolie." So naturally, the Europeans wanted ways to keep themselves apart from the riffraff. And here are a few examples of these laws in action. Chinese can only visit the Hong Kong Museum in the morning. For the rest of the day, the museum would be open for Europeans, but only after they first cleaned the museum during lunch. All Chinese land near the harbor, some 1.5 acres of it, were forcibly acquired and cleared so to prevent everyday mixing between the Chinese and Europeans. Certain areas were reserved exclusively for the British. The Peak District is today the most expensive in the world. Jack Ma had to pay hundreds of millions for a house there. That had it been the 1800s and early 1900s, all of his millions wouldn't help him one bit. The Peak used to be exclusively for whites. It was as English as any small English provincial town. And they worked really hard to keep it that way. Likewise, the southern portion of Chung Chau Island was set aside in 1919 as an exclusive vacation area for Europeans. Chinese were not allowed to reside there. When the bill came up in the Hong Kong Legislative Council, 2 Chinese members voted against it, calling it a racial legislation. The bill passed as every other legislator voted for it. To be a European in Hong Kong was to enjoy not only these social benefits, but vast economic and governmental ones as well. Colonial Hong Kong developed a reputation, one not totally unwarranted, for being a place where quote-unquote lower-class Europeans can go to and get top-level, highly well-paid positions simply for being white. All of the top colonial governmental positions were held by white Britons, a state of affairs that lasted far longer than it should have, basically until 1993. The vast majority of Hong Kong's legal force, judges, police, the like, was white. 95% of the police department were European deep into the 1970s. Even the British colony of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, on the other hand, they had put aside a third of such positions for the native populace by the 1920s. British government expatriates were paid more and promoted faster than Chinese people. For example, a British officer in 1914 can expect to be paid over 7 times more in salary than a Chinese officer of the same rank. In 1991, a newspaper pointed out that 51 senior Hong Kong colonial government officials had salaries higher than that of the UK Prime Minister himself. Expat benefits were also substantial. The Hong Kong government spent over 1.7 times more for a European than a Chinese in terms of benefits. Europeans enjoyed free trips back to Europe for themselves and family of up to 6 people every 2 years. They got partial reimbursement of tuition for exclusive European private schools. And let's top it all off with a final fact. The average British expatriate in Hong Kong with a family lives in a house or apartment over 2,500 square feet, 232 square meters large, in Hong Kong, of all places. Hong Kong's population throughout its colonial period was 98% Chinese. Throughout the 150-year-long colonization period, 2% or less of the population ruled over 98% without any semblance of democracy or fairness. And then the saddest thing, at the end of those 150 years, the British handed its rule over Hong Kong's 6 million people to China in 1997, and the British stepped out of those positions, and the Chinese stepped smoothly in. All right, everyone, have a good evening. Take care of yourself.
Next, with the courtesy of Fora.tv, the video of Mr. Raghuram Rajan at the World Economic Forum speaks about the colonial mentality that is holding back India.
Fora TV, the world is thinking.
As we become a more important economy on the global stage, we also have to alter how India engages with the world. In my view, we still engage with a colonial mentality which says we are the victims of what you've done in the past. We don't engage in a strong, constructive way which offers our view, our vision of what the future will look like. And we have so much as a country to contribute in terms of vision. The fact that India is a democracy, the fact that India has brought so many people along with it in the path of growth, that India is focused on environmentally sound technology. So much we can contribute. But yet, our whole reaction to the international economic dialogue is one of reaction rather than proactivity. And I've often wondered why we do this, why we don't take a bigger role in trying to shape that process. And this is where I think we have a very important deficiency, which is that the kind of intellectual fervor that emerges in India doesn't get translated outside. There's a lot of debate here, there's a lot of argumentation, but doesn't get translated outside. And I think part of the problem is academia in India doesn't do the kind of translation that academia elsewhere does, doesn't take a role in sending Indian ideas outside. For example, there's a lot of unique value to the kind of processes that Indian companies have come up with. In many ways, there's a unique Indian style of management. This is not about This is not about a Vedic style of management or something like that. There's something very real and concrete Indian companies have done over the last 15, 20 years, which needs to be broadcast outside. It includes, amongst other things, Indian companies are extremely adaptable. They have learned to deal with uncertainty. They have learned to try and innovate out of problem situations. They've tried to work, as CK says again and again, with a population which is at very low incomes but still cares about value for money. Lots of things that can be learned from the outside. But we need to communicate this. We need to talk about what Indian management means. It doesn't seem to me that we have articulated what it means. In part because it doesn't seem to me Indian academia has stepped up to the plate to contribute its vision. Similarly, in terms of global warming, in terms of climate change, where is India's position on this apart from reaction? I mean, when I worked at an international organization, it seemed to me again and again, all the ideas for change came from industrial countries. They put the ideas on the plate. It wasn't that they had the votes. It was they did the thinking and put the ideas on where they wanted to go. And the emerging market response, not just India, was often one of reaction. Oh, we don't like that, we don't want that, we don't want this, we don't want that, but never an alternative. And it seems to me it is high time that if we are going to become one of the big economies in the world, we need to match that with intellectual prowess. This is why I say people who say India is outsourcing 150,000 students a year, not a big deal because they're getting educated in the best institutions in the world, I think that's a problem. That's a problem because we're not creating the educational institutions in India which will create the academic human capital, which then will allow India's worldview, which exists in India, to propagate more widely and be known and have influence. So I think it's important that we think at the same time as we actually have economic influence, that we also have intellectual influence.
We have come to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Let us know the videos you like and leave your comment below. We have regular videos, so be sure to hit the red button below.